The rain fell in sheets across the Arizona desert that September evening in 1882, turning the dusty streets of Tombstone into rivers of mud as Franklin Irwin rode his sorrel mare toward the modest boarding house where he kept a room. He had just finished a 2-week cattle drive from the high country, his bones aching and his clothes stiff with dried sweat and trail dust, when he spotted her sitting on the church steps like a ghost draped in soaked calico. She sat perfectly still despite the downpour, her dark hair plastered to her face, hands folded in her lap as if waiting for judgment itself. Franklin pulled his mare to a halt, water streaming from the brim of his hat as he studied the strange sight. No woman in her right mind sat in weather like this, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. "Miss," he called out, swinging down from his saddle, "you all right there?" She did not answer at first, did not even acknowledge his presence. Franklin stepped closer, his boots sinking into the mud with each step. When he reached the bottom of the church steps, she finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red from crying, her lips trembling from cold or grief or both. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the rain. Franklin did not hesitate. He shrugged off his long coat, the heavy oilskin that had kept him reasonably dry, and climbed the steps to drape it around her shoulders. She looked up at him with surprise, those dark eyes widening as the warmth of the coat settled around her. "You cannot just sit here in the rain," Franklin said, offering his hand. "Let me help you." "You do not know me," she replied, but she took his hand anyway, her fingers ice cold against his palm. "Does not matter much," Franklin said, helping her to her feet. "Nobody deserves to sit alone in weather like this." He guided her to his mare, then helped her mount before swinging up behind her. She trembled against him as they rode the short distance to the boarding house, and Franklin found himself holding the reins with one hand while the other steadied her in the saddle. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, took one look at the bedraggled woman and immediately ushered them inside. Franklin stood dripping in the parlor while the older woman led his unexpected guest upstairs to get dry. He heard water being poured into a basin, heard the murmur of female voices, and realized he had no idea what came next. When Mrs. Patterson returned, she fixed him with a knowing look. "She says her name is Violet Garrison. Says she arrived on today's stage from Santa Fe with plans to meet her intended, only to find out he married another woman 3 weeks ago." Franklin felt anger kindle in his chest. "What kind of man does that?" "The worst kind," Mrs. Patterson said. "Left her stranded here with barely $2 to her name. She spent what little she had on a meal, then went to the church to pray for guidance." The older woman shook her head. "I have given her some dry clothes and told her she can stay the night, but beyond that, I cannot afford charity." "Put her lodging on my account," Franklin said without thinking. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Franklin Irwin, you have known this girl all of 10 minutes. "Then I have known her long enough to see she needs help," he replied. "How much do I owe you?" "For tonight, nothing." "But you think about what you are doing, son. A young man paying for a young woman's room, tongues will wag." Franklin knew she was right, but he also knew he could not send Violet back out into that rain. "Let them wag. She needs a safe place tonight." He climbed the stairs to his own small room, peeled off his wet clothes, and lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Rain drummed against the window, and somewhere in this building was a woman whose world had collapsed around her. He thought about that image of her on the church steps, so utterly alone, and something in his chest tightened. Franklin had spent the last 5 years working ranches across Arizona and New Mexico, saving every penny he could toward buying his own spread someday. He kept to himself mostly, did his work, earned a reputation as a reliable hand. Romance had never been part of his plan. At 26, he figured he had time enough for that later, after he had land and a house worthy of bringing a wife home to. But something about Violet Garrison had reached past all his careful planning and grabbed hold of his heart with startling swiftness. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Franklin dressed and went downstairs to find Violet already in the dining room, wearing a simple gray dress that Mrs. Patterson must have loaned her. She looked fragile in the morning light, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "May I join you?" Franklin asked. She nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I should thank you properly for last night. You were kind when you had no reason to be." "Common decency is not kindness," Franklin said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Patterson. "Any man worth his salt would have done the same." "In my experience, most men are not worth their salt," Violet said with a ghost of a smile. "Present company excepted, it seems." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the clink of spoons against china as other boarders served themselves breakfast from the sideboard. Franklin studied her face, noting the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, the set of her jaw that spoke of determination despite everything. "What will you do?" he asked finally. Violet took a long sip of coffee before answering. "I have been asking myself that same question all night. I have no money for a return ticket to Santa Fe. Even if I did, I have nothing to return to. My parents died last year, the farm sold to pay their debts. Marrying Charles was supposed to be my fresh start," she laughed bitterly. "Some start. You could find work here in Tombstone," Franklin suggested. "Town is still growing, despite what happened last year at the OK Corral. Plenty of respectable establishments need help. And plenty of not-so-respectable ones too, I imagine," Violet said. "A woman alone with no references, no family to vouch for her. I know what kind of work I am likely to find." The thought made Franklin's jaw tighten. "Not if you have someone to vouch for you." Violet looked at him sharply. "Why would you do that? You know nothing about me. I could be a thief or a liar or worse. Are you? No. Then that is all I need to know," Franklin said. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Look, I am not much for pretty speeches or fancy manners. But I know what I saw last night. A woman who had been dealt a terrible hand but still had the strength to sit in that church and pray instead of giving up. That tells me everything about your character." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, but she blinked them back. "You are either the kindest man in Arizona or the biggest fool." "Probably both," Franklin admitted, and was rewarded with a real smile this time, brief but genuine. Over the next few days, Franklin made good on his promise. He spoke to merchants and shop owners, putting in a word for Violet wherever he could. Most were hesitant to hire an unknown woman, even with Franklin's endorsement. It was Mrs. Chen, who ran a dry goods store on the edge of town, who finally offered Violet work. "I need someone with a steady hand for sewing," Mrs. Chen explained in her precise English. "My eyes are not what they used to be. If you can do alterations and mending, I can pay $3 a week plus meals." Violet accepted gratefully, and Franklin watched as she threw herself into the work with fierce determination. He found excuses to stop by the dry goods store more often than necessary, sometimes bringing flowers he claimed he had picked on his way into town, other times just checking to see if she needed anything. "You are going to wear a path in the floorboards, Mrs. Chen told him one afternoon, amusement dancing in her dark eyes. "Just court the girl properly and be done with it." Franklin felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I am not, that is, we are not." "You are and you should be," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "She is a good woman, you are a good man." Stop dancing around it. That evening, Franklin waited outside the dry goods store until Violet emerged, her arms full of fabric scraps Mrs. Chen had given her to practice her stitching at home. He fell into step beside her, taking the bundle from her arms despite her protests. "I have been thinking," he said as they walked toward the boarding house. "That sounds dangerous," Violet teased, and he was glad to hear lightness in her voice again. "There is a dance next Saturday at the community hall. Nothing fancy, just the usual folks from town. Would you like to go with me?" Violet stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The setting sun painted her face in shades of gold and amber, and Franklin thought he had never seen anyone more beautiful. "Franklin Irwin," she said slowly, "are you asking to court me?" "Yes," he said simply, "if you will have me." "I have nothing to offer you," Violet said. "No dowry, no family connections, no prospects beyond mending torn shirts for $3 a week. And I have nothing but a rented room, a horse, and dreams of a ranch I may never own," Franklin replied. "But I have this, right here, right now, and I would like to spend it with you." Violet's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You gave me your coat that night in the rain. I think you have been giving me pieces of yourself ever since." "Only if you want them," Franklin said. "I do," Violet whispered. "Yes, I will go to the dance with you. Yes, I will let you court me. Yes to all of it." Franklin wanted to kiss her right there in the street, propriety be damned, but he settled for taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "Then I am the luckiest man in Arizona." The week leading up to the dance passed in a blur of anticipation. Franklin worked his usual job at the Carter Ranch just outside town, breaking horses and mending fences, but his mind was always on Saturday night. He bought a new shirt from Mrs. Chen, who winked at Violet while measuring his shoulders, and borrowed boot polish from another boarder to shine his scuffed leather boots. Violet, meanwhile, transformed one of Mrs. Patterson's old dresses with her skillful needle, taking in the waist and adding delicate embroidery to the collar. Franklin caught glimpses of her working on it in the boarding house parlor, her head bent in concentration, and each time his heart did something strange and wonderful in his chest. Saturday arrived with the promise of cool autumn weather, the desert heat finally breaking into something more comfortable. Franklin spent an hour getting ready, slicking back his sandy hair and checking his reflection a dozen times in the small mirror above his washstand. When he knocked on Violet's door at 7 o'clock, his palms were sweating despite the cool evening air. She opened the door and took his breath away. The dress was a deep blue that brought out the richness of her dark hair and eyes. She had pinned her hair up in a style that left soft curls framing her face, and she wore a simple silver locket that she said had been her mother's. "You look beautiful," Franklin said, his voice rough with emotion. "You clean up rather well yourself," Violet replied, her cheeks flushing pink with pleasure. They walked to the community hall arm in arm, joining the stream of other couples and families heading toward the music and laughter. Inside, lanterns cast a warm glow over the polished wood floor, and a group of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner. Franklin recognized most of the faces: ranchers and shopkeepers, miners and their wives, all the regular folks who made Tombstone their home. "Franklin Irwin, is that you all spiffed up?" called out Jack Morrison, a fellow ranch hand. "Never thought I would see the day." "Never thought I would have a reason," Franklin called back, pulling Violet a little closer. They danced the first waltz, and Franklin was grateful for the lessons his mother had insisted on back in Kansas before he headed west. Violet moved gracefully in his arms, following his lead with an ease that surprised him. "You are a wonderful dancer," he said as they turned across the floor. "My mother loved to dance," Violet replied. "She taught me when I was a girl, said every woman should know how to waltz properly, even if she never got the chance to wear a fancy ball gown. "I am sorry you lost her," Franklin said. "And your father." "The fever took them both within days of each other," Violet said, sadness clouding her eyes. "One moment I had a family and a home, and the next I had nothing. That is when Charles wrote, offering marriage. I thought it was Providence looking after me." She looked up at Franklin. "I was wrong about the Providence part, but I was not wrong about being looked after. It just came from a different source than I expected." Franklin held her closer as they danced, wanting to shield her from every hurt the world might throw at her. "You will never be alone like that again," he promised. "Not if I have anything to say about it." They danced until Franklin's feet ached and his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool night air. Between dances, they drank lemonade and talked with other townspeople, and Franklin watched with pride as Violet charmed everyone she met. Mrs. Chen gave him a knowing nod from across the room, and even crusty old Judge Wilcox commented that Franklin had chosen well. As the evening wound down and the musicians played a final slow song, Franklin led Violet out onto the porch for some air. The desert stretched out before them, vast and dark under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. "I have been thinking about the future," Franklin said, leaning against the porch railing. "What about it?" Violet asked, standing close beside him. "I have been saving money for 5 years, working every job I could find, putting aside every penny. I have almost enough to buy land of my own, start a small ranch. Nothing fancy at first, just enough to run some cattle, maybe breed a few good horses." He turned to face her fully. "I always pictured myself doing it alone, building something from nothing through sheer stubbornness. But lately I have been picturing something different." "What do you picture?" Violet's voice was barely above a whisper. "You," Franklin said simply. "I picture you there with me. I picture building a life together, not just a ranch." "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but Violet, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Violet reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "That night in the rain, sitting on those church steps, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything and had nothing left to hope for. Then you appeared out of the storm and gave me your coat, and with it, you gave me hope again. You gave me kindness when I had forgotten what that felt like. You gave me respect when I expected only pity. And now you are offering me a future when I thought I had none." "Is that a yes?" Franklin asked, hardly daring to breathe. "That is a yes to whatever you are asking," Violet said. "If you are asking to keep courting me, yes. If you are asking me to wait while you save the rest of your money and buy that land, yes. If you are asking me to share that future you are building, yes to that too." Franklin cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded. She tasted like lemonade and hope, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Franklin felt like he could conquer the world. "I am going to marry you, Violet Garrison," he said. "Maybe not tomorrow or next month, but someday soon. I am going to build you the best ranch in Arizona, and we are going to fill it with horses and cattle and children and love." "That sounds perfect," Violet said, resting her head against his chest. "That sounds like everything I ever wanted." The weeks that followed established a pattern that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Franklin worked at the Carter Ranch during the day, taking on extra jobs whenever he could to add to his savings. Violet continued her work at Mrs. Chen's dry goods store, her skill with a needle earning her a reputation that brought in more customers. In the evenings, they would meet for supper at the boarding house or take walks through town, talking about everything and nothing. Franklin learned that Violet loved poetry, but could never remember the words properly. often mixing up lines from different poems in ways that made him laugh. Violet discovered that Franklin could not carry a tune to save his life, but hummed constantly while he worked, blissfully unaware of how off-key he was. They shared their dreams and their fears, their memories of childhood and their hopes for tomorrow. 3 months after that rainy night when they first met, Franklin took Violet out to see the land he had been eyeing. It sat about 10 miles north of Tombstone, nestled in a valley with good water access and natural grazing. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the property was being sold by the bank for a reasonable price. "It is not much to look at right now," Franklin said as they rode across the scrubby terrain. "But with work, it could be something special. See that rise over there? Perfect spot for a house, protected from the worst of the weather but high enough to catch the breeze in summer." Violet dismounted and walked the land, her skirts trailing in the dust. She examined the small creek that wound through the property, tested the soil with her fingers, studied the way the hills sheltered the valley. Franklin watched her, trying to see the land through her eyes. "It is perfect," she said finally, turning to him with a radiant smile. "I can see it all, the house you described, the corrals for horses, cattle grazing in that meadow. I can see our life here, Franklin." "Our life," Franklin repeated, loving the sound of those words. "I have enough saved now to make an offer on the land and still have a bit left for materials. But it will be tight, and we will have to do most of the building ourselves." "I am not afraid of hard work," Violet said, "and we will not be doing it ourselves. We will be doing it together. There is a difference." That evening, Franklin went to the bank and made his offer. 2 days later, the land was his. He stood in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, holding the deed in his hands, and felt the weight of possibility settle over him. This was real. This was happening. "I want to marry you before we start building," he told Violet that night. "I want us to do this as husband and wife, building our home together from the very first nail." Violet's eyes widened. "Are you proposing to me, Franklin Irwin?" Franklin dropped to one knee right there in the boarding house parlor, not caring that Mrs. Patterson and 2 other boarders were watching with undisguised interest. "Violet Garrison, I know I do not have much to offer you yet besides hard work and dreams, but I can promise you my whole heart and my whole life. Will you marry me?" Violet pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly. "Yes, you wonderful, ridiculous man. Yes, I will marry you." They set the date for 3 weeks hence, giving them enough time to make simple arrangements. Neither of them wanted a fancy wedding, just something small and meaningful surrounded by the friends they had made in Tombstone. Violet sewed herself a simple white dress, and Franklin bought a new suit that he knew he would only wear on Sundays and special occasions after the wedding. The ceremony took place at the same church where Franklin had first found Violet sitting in the rain. Reverend Matthews performed the service, his voice booming with enthusiasm as he pronounced them husband and wife. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears. Mrs. Chen gave them a beautiful quilt she had sewn herself, and Judge Wilcox surprised everyone by playing a cheerful tune on his fiddle during the small reception afterward. Franklin had used part of his remaining savings to rent a small house in town for them to stay in while they built their ranch. It was modest, just 3 rooms and a tiny kitchen, but it was theirs. That first night as man and wife, they lay in their narrow bed and talked until dawn, making plans and dreaming dreams. "I love you," Violet said as the sun began to paint the sky pink and gold. "I never thought I would say those words and mean them so completely." "I loved you from the moment I saw you on those church steps," Franklin admitted. "You looked so lost but so determined not to break. I knew right then that you were someone special." "You gave me your coat," Violet said softly. "But you gave me so much more than that. You gave me yourself, your future, your dreams. You made room for me in a life you had already planned out. You made my life worth planning, Franklin replied, kissing her forehead. Everything I build from now on, I build for us. The next day, they rode out to their land and began the hard work of building their future. Franklin had purchased lumber and supplies with the last of his savings, and he had called in favors from every man he had ever worked with. Jack Morrison showed up with 3 other ranch hands, ready to work in exchange for nothing more than good food and the satisfaction of helping a friend. Even old Judge Wilcox appeared one morning, rolled up his sleeves, and proved surprisingly handy with a hammer. Violet worked alongside the men, measuring and sawing, her hands blistering but her spirit undaunted. Mrs. Chen sent her daughter with baskets of food at midday, and Mrs. Patterson arrived one afternoon with a wagon full of furniture she claimed she no longer needed. The house took shape slowly, rising from the red earth like something inevitable. It was simple but well built, with a wide front porch perfect for sitting on cool evenings, a large kitchen with windows that let in the morning sun, and 3 bedrooms for the family they hoped to have. Franklin built Violet a small sewing room off the main bedroom, with good light and shelves for her thread and fabrics. When the last shingle was nailed to the roof, and the last window hung, Franklin carried Violet over the threshold of their completed home. She laughed with delight, her arms tight around his neck, and he spun her in a circle in the empty front room. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." "First part anyway," Franklin replied. "Now comes the real work of making it a ranch." They spent the following months establishing their operation. Franklin bought a small herd of cattle and several good horses, using money he earned by breaking horses for other ranchers. Violet set up a vegetable garden and chickens, and she took in sewing work from women in Tombstone who had heard of her skill with a needle. Their first winter on the ranch was harsh, testing them in ways they had not anticipated. A cold snap in January killed 3 of their cattle, and a broken water pump nearly dried up their well. But they faced each challenge together, Franklin's strength complementing Violet's resourcefulness. One particularly cold night, huddled together under Mrs. Chen's quilt, Violet told Franklin she was pregnant. He held her close, joy and terror warring in his chest. "We will manage," he said, though he was not sure how. "We will figure it out." "Of course we will," Violet said with certainty. "We have come this far, have we not? A baby is just the next adventure." Their son was born in late summer, arriving during a thunderstorm that reminded Franklin of the night he had first met Violet. Dr. Morrison, Jack's uncle, attended the birth, and Mrs. Patterson came to help afterward. The baby was healthy and strong, with Violet's dark hair and Franklin's blue eyes. They named him James, after Franklin's father, and from the moment Franklin held his son in his arms, he understood what it meant to have your heart exist outside your body. He had thought he knew love when he married Violet, but this was different, a fierce protective instinct that would have driven him to move mountains if necessary. Violet proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even during the long, sleepless nights. Franklin would often wake to find her sitting in the rocking chair he had built, nursing James while watching the sun rise over their land. Those quiet moments, his wife and child safe in their home that they had built with their own hands, felt like the fulfillment of every promise he had ever made. The ranch grew slowly but steadily over the next few years. Franklin's reputation as a horse breaker brought in good money, and Violet's sewing business expanded to the point where she had to turn away customers. James grew into a rambunctious toddler who loved following his father around the ranch, trying to help with chores in his own chaotic way. When James was 3, Violet told Franklin she was pregnant again. This time the news came with less terror and more excitement. They knew what to expect now, had weathered enough storms to feel confident they could handle another child. Their daughter arrived on a clear spring morning, her birth so quick and easy that Dr. Morrison barely arrived in time. She had Violet's delicate features and Franklin's stubborn chin, and they named her Sarah, after Violet's mother. With 2 children and a growing ranch, life became beautifully chaotic. Franklin hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heaviest ranch work, freeing him to spend more time with his family. Violet taught sewing lessons to women in town twice a week, with Sarah strapped to her back and James playing quietly with his wooden horses. The years passed in a blur of seasons and growth. James learned to ride before he could properly raid, and Sarah proved to have her mother's gift with needle and thread. Franklin expanded the ranch, buying neighboring land when it became available, until they had one of the more successful operations in the territory. But success had not changed the fundamental truth of their marriage. Franklin still found Violet beautiful, especially in the moments when she did not know he was watching. The way she hummed while cooking dinner, the gentle patience with which she helped James with his reading lessons, the fierce love in her eyes when she looked at their children. All of it made him fall in love with her again and again. One evening, after the children were asleep, Franklin found Violet sitting on the front porch watching the sunset. He settled beside her, pulling her close. "You ever think about that night in the rain?" he asked. "All the time," Violet said. "I think about how lost I was, how certain I was that my life was over. I think about the despair I felt, sitting on those church steps with nowhere to go and no one to turn to." "I am sorry you had to go through that," Franklin said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am not," Violet said, surprising him. "Because it led me here to you, to this life we have built. If Charles had not broken my heart, I never would have been sitting in that rain. I never would have met you. Everything I love, everything I treasure, came from that terrible moment." "I gave you my coat," Franklin said softly. "You gave me so much more than a coat," Violet replied. "You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me dignity when I felt worthless. You gave me love when I thought I was unlovable. And you gave me a future I could never have dreamed of on my own." "You gave me a reason to build that future," Franklin said. "Before you, I was just a cowboy with vague plans and no real purpose. You made me want to be more, do more, build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from pink to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over them that first night, the same stars that had witnessed every struggle and triumph of their marriage. "We should have another baby," Violet said suddenly. Franklin looked at her in surprise. "Really? You want another one?" "I want a house full of children," Violet said. "I want noise and chaos and love spilling out of every corner. I want what I never had growing up, siblings and family, and the security of knowing you are part of something bigger than yourself." "Then we will have more children," Franklin agreed. "As many as you want, though I am going to have to expand the house again." Violet laughed, the sound carrying across the desert evening. "You are always expanding something. The house, the ranch, my heart." Their third child, another son they named William, arrived the following year. Then came twin girls, Emma and Grace, who kept the entire household in delightful chaos. Franklin did indeed expand the house, adding an entire second story and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing family. The ranch prospered beyond Franklin's wildest dreams. His horses became sought after throughout the territory, known for their intelligence and steady temperament. Violet's sewing had evolved into a small business, employing 3 other women from town and supplying dry goods stores across southern Arizona. But more than the financial success, it was the life they had built that mattered. Sunday dinners with all 5 children gathered around the table, James now tall enough to help his father with the horses, Sarah teaching her younger sisters to sew, William trying to sneak extra biscuits when he thought no one was looking. These were the moments that defined their wealth. Judge Wilcox, now well into his 80s, still came to visit occasionally, regaling the children with stories of the old days when Tombstone was wild and lawless. Mrs. Chen had passed away peacefully in her sleep several years back, but her daughter had taken over the dry goods store and remained close friends with Violet. Mrs. Patterson had finally retired from running the boarding house, moving into a small cottage that Franklin had built for her on the edge of their property, where she happily spoiled their children as the grandmother they otherwise lacked. When James turned 18, he announced his intention to start his own ranch, using skills his father had taught him. Franklin felt pride and sadness in equal measure as he helped his son select land and plan his future. Violet cried the day James moved into his own small house, but they were happy tears. "Our baby is a man now," she said, watching James ride off to his new property. "We have 4 more to raise yet," Franklin reminded her. "And something tells me the girls are going to be even more challenging than the boys." He was right. Sarah fell in love with a young lawyer from Tucson, and Franklin had to resist the urge to chase the man off with a shotgun. But seeing the way the young man looked at his daughter, with the same reverence Franklin still felt for Violet, he gave his blessing to their courtship. The twins grew into beautiful, headstrong young women who kept their parents on their toes with their various adventures and schemes. William proved to have a gift for business, helping to expand the ranch's horse breeding program into one of the most respected in the territory. Through it all, Franklin and Violet remained the steady center of their family's universe. They still took evening walks together when they could steal the time, still sat on the porch watching sunsets, still found moments to be simply Franklin and Violet, the cowboy and the woman he had found in the rain. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Franklin took Violet back to Tombstone, back to the church where he had first seen her. It had been repainted and updated over the years, but the steps were the same. "Sit with me," Franklin said, gesturing to those steps. Violet looked at him quizzically, but settled beside him on the smooth stone. "Why are we sitting on church steps like a couple of vagrants?" "Because this is where it all started," Franklin said. "This is where I found you, where our story began. I wanted to come back here and tell you something." "What is that?" Violet asked, taking his hand. "That I would do it all again, exactly the same way. Every struggle, every hardship, every moment of doubt or fear, I would go through it all again just to end up here with you with our life together." Violet leaned her head on his shoulder. "You gave me your coat that night." "I gave you my future," Franklin corrected gently. "And you gave me yours. We built something beautiful together, Violet, not just the ranch or the house or even our children, though they are all wonderful. We built a life based on love and trust and partnership. We proved that good things can come from the darkest moments." "I was so broken that night," Violet said softly. "I thought there was nothing left of me worth saving." "You were never broken," Franklin said firmly. "You were bent by circumstance, tested by hardship, but never broken. You had the strength to sit in that rain and pray for guidance instead of giving up. That is not broken, Violet. That is steel wrapped in silk." They sat on those church steps as the afternoon faded into evening, remembering and reflecting. When they finally rose to head home, both felt the weight of years and the lightness of love in equal measure. The Arizona Territory became a state in 1912, and Franklin and Violet celebrated by hosting a massive party at their ranch. Neighbors came from miles around, and all 5 of their children were there with families of their own. James brought his wife and 3 sons. Sarah arrived with her lawyer husband and 2 daughters. William came with his new bride, and the twins showed up with a collection of suitors that gave Franklin a headache. Standing on his porch, watching 3 generations of his family celebrate, Franklin felt Violet slip her hand into his. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and fine lines crinkled around her eyes when she smiled. But she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Look at what we made," she said, gesturing to the crowd below. "We made a family," Franklin agreed. "We made a legacy." "We made a love story," Violet corrected. "Everything else just came from that." As the party continued into the evening, with music and dancing and children running wild, Franklin pulled Violet close and waltzed her across the porch, just as they had danced that first night at the community hall so many years ago. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too," Violet replied. "My cowboy who found me in the rain." "My woman who trusted a stranger enough to take his coat," Franklin countered. They danced until the stars came out, until the music faded and the guests departed, until it was just the 2 of them standing on their porch looking out over the land they had built together. Somewhere in the house, their children and grandchildren were settling in for the night, but this moment belonged to Franklin and Violet alone. Years continued to pass in the way years do, bringing joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. Judge Wilcox passed away peacefully at 93, leaving Franklin a letter thanking him for the friendship and the music and the reminder that life could be good at any age. Mrs. Patterson followed a few years later, surrounded by the family she had helped Franklin build. Franklin began to feel his age in his joints and his back, the legacy of decades of hard ranch work. But he still rode out every morning to check on the horses, still made improvements to the ranch, still looked for ways to build a better future for his children and grandchildren. Violet's hands grew stiff with arthritis, making it harder to sew with the precision she once had. But she still taught sewing lessons to her granddaughters, still tended her garden, still met Franklin on the porch every evening to watch the sunset. When Franklin turned 65, William suggested he should retire and let the younger generation take over the ranch completely. Franklin resisted at first, but Violet gently pointed out that they had earned the right to rest, to enjoy the fruits of their labor without the constant worry of running an operation. So they stepped back, though never fully retired. Franklin became an advisor rather than an active manager, and Violet spent her time writing down family recipes and stories for future generations. They traveled some, visiting places they had always talked about seeing, but they always came home to their ranch, their porch, their sunset. One evening, sitting in their familiar spots with a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the desert chill, Violet turned to Franklin with a question. "You have any regrets?" she asked. Franklin thought about it seriously, wanting to give her an honest answer. "I regret that time I tried to breed that impossible stallion and nearly got myself killed. I regret not standing up to that crooked cattle buyer in '89. I regret missing Sarah's first day of school because I was on a buying trip." He paused, squeezing her hand. "But about us. About our life together. Not a single regret, Violet. Not one. Not even that I came with nothing. That you had to support me, build everything while carrying the weight of both of us. You carried me just as much as I carried you," Franklin said firmly. "Maybe I provided the physical labor, but you provided the heart and soul of everything we built. This ranch, our family, the life we made, none of it would exist without you. You were never a burden, Violet. You were the reason for everything." Tears slipped down Violet's weathered cheeks. "I was so scared that night in the rain, so utterly lost and terrified. "I know," Franklin said gently, pulling her close. "But you were never alone again after that night. We faced everything together." "Together," Violet echoed, resting her head on his shoulder just as she had done 1,000 times before. The seasons turned, bringing their 75th year on Earth to both Franklin and Violet. Their children threw them a combined birthday celebration, and the ranch overflowed with family. 15 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren filled the house with noise and laughter, and Franklin looked around at the legacy he and Violet had created. James, now running his own successful ranch, stood to give a toast. "To my parents, who taught us that love is not just a feeling but an action. That building a life together means showing up every day, through good times and bad, and choosing each other again and again. You gave us an example worth following, and we are all better for it." Sarah added her own toast. "To the cowboy who found a woman in the rain and had the wisdom to see her worth. And to the woman who had the courage to accept help from a stranger and the grace to build a partnership that has lasted over 50 years. Franklin felt emotion tighten his throat as he raised his glass. "To Violet, the love of my life, the mother of my children, the partner who made every dream possible. You took the coat I offered and gave me a future beyond anything I could have imagined." Violet raised her own glass with trembling hands. "To Franklin, who saw me at my lowest and loved me anyway. Who built me a home and filled it with children and taught me what it means to be truly cherished. You did not just save me that night in the rain, my love. You gave me a reason to live, to hope, to dream. Everything I am, everything we built together, started with your kindness and grew from your love." They touched glasses, their eyes locked, and in that moment they were not two people in their 70s surrounded by family. They were a young cowboy and a heartbroken woman meeting on church steps in the rain. They were nervous lovers at their first dance. They were newlyweds building a house with their own hands. They were young parents marveling at their firstborn. They were everything they had been and everything they had become. The party continued long into the night, but eventually Franklin and Violet slipped away to their bedroom, leaving the celebration to the younger generations. They lay in their bed, the same bed they had shared for over 50 years, and held each other close. "Tell me again about that night," Violet requested, as she had countless times over the years. Franklin smiled, knowing she did not really need him to tell the story again. She remembered it as clearly as he did. But it had become their ritual, their way of reconnecting with the beginning of their journey. "I was riding home from a cattle drive," Franklin began, his voice soft in the darkness. "I was tired and sore and thinking about nothing more than a hot meal and my bed. And then I saw you, sitting on those church steps in the pouring rain. You looked like you were waiting for the world to end, but you were not crying or wailing or making a scene. You were just sitting there with this quiet dignity, like you were determined to face whatever came with your head held high." "I was praying," Violet murmured, "asking God to show me what to do next. And then this muddy cowboy rode up and offered you his coat," Franklin continued. "The best answer to prayer I ever received," Violet said, "though I did not recognize it at the time. I did not plan to fall in love with you," Franklin admitted, though he had told her this before. "I just wanted to help someone in need. But then you looked up at me with those dark eyes full of pain and strength, and something in my heart just knew. This was the woman I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting." "Love at first sight," Violet said. "Love at first sight," Franklin agreed, "and every sight since." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, their breathing synchronized after so many years together, their hearts beating in familiar rhythm. The years that followed were gentle ones, full of family gatherings and quiet moments. Franklin's health remained relatively good, though he moved slower and needed afternoon naps. Violet's arthritis worsened, but she remained sharp and engaged, always ready with advice or a story for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary surrounded by their family, and Franklin gave Violet a new coat, a beautiful wool one lined with silk. She laughed through her tears as she put it on. "Still giving me your coat after all these years," she said. "Always," Franklin replied. "Though this time I can afford a nicer one." On a warm October evening in 1925, Franklin and Violet sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. The air smelled of desert sage and approaching autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "It has been a good life," Violet said softly. "The best life," Franklin agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "Do you remember what you told me that first night, when you found me in the rain?" Violet asked. Franklin thought back through the decades. "I said you could not just sit there in the rain." "You said nobody deserves to sit alone in weather like this," Violet corrected. "And you were right. Nobody deserves to be alone in the storms of life. You made sure I never was alone again." "We faced every storm together," Franklin said, reaching for her hand. "And we will face whatever comes next together, too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky paint itself in shades of orange and purple and gold. The ranch stretched out before them, green and prosperous, dotted with horses and cattle and the fruits of a lifetime of labor. Somewhere in the house behind them, their children and grandchildren moved about, preparing dinner and settling in for the evening. "I love you, Franklin Irwin," Violet said. "From that first moment in the rain to this very second, I have loved you with everything I am." "And I love you, Violet Irwin," Franklin replied. "You made my life worth living. You made every struggle worthwhile. You are my greatest adventure and my safest harbor, all wrapped into one incredible woman." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in twilight, they held each other close and gave thanks for the gift they had been given. A gift that started with a coat offered in the rain and grew into a love that spanned a lifetime. Franklin Irwin lived to be 82 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep with Violet by his side. His funeral brought people from all over Arizona, friends and family and business associates who had known him as a man of integrity and kindness. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built, under a headstone that read, "Beloved husband, father, grandfather." He lived with honor and love. Violet lived another 3 years, spending her time surrounded by her children and their families. She told stories about Franklin to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through her words and her love. She never remarried, never even considered it. Franklin had been her great love, her partner, the answer to a prayer she had whispered in the rain so many decades ago. When Violet passed away at 85, she was laid to rest beside Franklin on that hill overlooking the ranch. Her headstone read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother." She lived with grace and love. Between their 2 stones, their children placed a third small marker that simply read, "Together in life, together in eternity." The ranch continued on through the generations, passed down from child to child, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Franklin and Violet had built. The house was preserved and expanded, the land cherished and protected, the horses bred with the same care and attention that Franklin had insisted upon. But more than the physical legacy, it was the story of Franklin and Violet that endured. It became family legend, told to each new generation as they grew old enough to understand. The story of a cowboy who found a woman sitting in the rain, who gave her his coat and, in doing so, gave her his future. The story of a woman who had lost everything, but found the courage to accept help from a stranger and build a love that lasted a lifetime. Their great-great-grandchildren would visit those graves on the hill and leave wildflowers, imagining the young couple who had started it all. They would sit on the porch of the ranch house, the same porch where Franklin and Violet had spent countless evenings, and feel the weight of love and legacy surrounding them. And on rainy nights, when the desert storms rolled in and turned the world to water and wind, people swore they could sometimes see two figures on that porch. A tall man with sandy hair and a woman with dark eyes, sitting close together and watching the rain, wrapped in a coat that had started everything. Not ghosts exactly, but echoes of a love so strong it had seeped into the very land itself. A reminder that kindness and courage and choosing to love can create something that outlasts any single lifetime. The story of Franklin and Violet became more than just family history. It became a touchstone, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life are actually doorways to something beautiful. That giving without expectation of return can lead to the greatest rewards. That building a life with someone is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and choosing each other again and again. Their legacy was not just in the prosperous ranch or the large family they had created. It was in the model they provided for what love could be. Not perfect, not without struggle or hardship, but real and enduring and worth fighting for. They had taken nothing, a cowboy with dreams and a woman who had lost everything, and built something extraordinary through partnership and dedication, an unwavering commitment to each other. The coat that Franklin had given Violet that rainy night, the catalyst for everything that followed, was preserved by the family in a cedar chest. It was old and worn, the oilskin cracked with age, but it was treated with reverence. On their wedding days, each of Franklin and Violet's descendants would touch that coat, connecting themselves to the moment that had started it all, promising to honor the example set by their ancestors. And so the story lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring nature of true love. The cowboy who gave his coat in the rain and the woman who accepted it had built more than a ranch or a family. They had built a legacy of love that would echo through the ages, inspiring each new generation to believe in the transformative power of choosing kindness, choosing love, choosing each other. Their story was complete, a circle closed, a promise kept, a love fulfilled. From that rainy night in 1882 to the peaceful graves on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, Franklin and Violet had lived fully and loved deeply. They had taken the broken pieces of one life and the unformed dreams of another and woven them into something beautiful and lasting. And that, in the end, was their greatest achievement. Not the land or the wealth or even the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. It was the simple, profound truth that love, real love, can transform everything. That a moment of kindness in the rain can ripple forward through time, creating waves that touch countless lives in ways both seen and unseen. Franklin gave Violet his coat and his future, and in return she gave him a life worth living and a love worth remembering. Together they proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, and that the truest riches are measured not in gold or land, but in the depth of connection between two souls who choose each other, day after day, year after year, until death, and even beyond.